Tangent. Are tangents liminal? Tangent. They're super fucking liminal. Part 1. Liminal spaces. Liminal spaces have gotten a lot of attention online as a genre of photography over the last few years. For the people who do not know what liminal spaces are, it's probably best to begin not with definitions, but with examples. This hallway is a liminal space, and this courtyard, and this road, this gas station is liminal. This playground is super liminal. I don't know what this is, but it's liminal. The sidewalk ends, that's really liminal. This is liminal. It's super fucking liminal. The question is, why do so many people feel a strange stirring of emotion when looking at these images? Do you feel a strange stirring of emotion when looking at these images? Leave a comment down below. If you do feel a strange stirring of emotion, that's good, because in this tangent, I'm going to try to explain and describe that feeling. And if you feel absolutely nothing looking at these images, then you're probably wondering, why are we doing a tangent about hallways? Why did patrons vote for this? Well, because it's an aesthetic, okay? You don't have to like the aesthetic, but you have to face the reality that many of us are connoisseurs of hallways. r/liminal space has more than 600,000 members on Reddit. The hallway fandom is growing. Please don't click away. So far as I can tell, this basic genre goes back to a 2016 Tumblr post, places where reality is a bit altered. Any Target, churches in Texas, abandoned 7-Elevens, your bedroom at 5 a.m., hospitals at midnight, warehouses that smell like dust, lighthouses with lights that don't work anymore, empty parking lots, ponds and lakes in suburban neighborhoods, rooftops in the early morning, inside a dark cabinet, playgrounds at night, rest stops on highways, deep in the mountains, early in the morning wherever it's just snowed, trails by the highway just out of earshot of traffic, schools during breaks, those little beaches right next to ferry docks, bowling alleys, unfamiliar McDonald's on long road trips, your friend's living room once everybody but you is asleep, laundromats at midnight. We're not in Kansas anymore, Dorothy, so strap in, we're about to get into some wild shit. Galleries and art museums that are empty except for you, the lighting section of Home Depot, stairwells, hospital waiting rooms, airports from midnight to 7 a.m., bathrooms and small concert venues. I just got the weirdest feeling, I swear. Kansas is going bye-bye. Any Target. A helpful reblogger jumps in. Okay, listen, there are reasons for this. A lot of these places are called liminal spaces, which means they're throwaways from one space to the next. Places like rest stops, stairwells, trains, parking lots, waiting rooms, airports feel weird when you're in them because their existence is not about themselves, but about things before and after them. They have no definitive place outside of their relationship to the spaces you're coming from and going to. Reality feels altered here because we're not really supposed to be in them for a long time or think about them as their own entities, and when we do, they seem odd and out of place. Since 2016, the term liminal space has stuck, and this extremely Tumblr-ish phenomenon has weirdly passed over into Reddit, which is unusual because Reddit is not known for being like an aesthetics fandom. It's a very Tumblr behavior, so I don't have a theory about that, but I do think we're ready for some definitions. What does liminal mean? Merriam-Webster's second definition, yes, I'm citing the dictionary like some kind of rube.
Webster's defines it as
of relating to or being an intermediate state, phase, or condition, in between, transitional. So etymologically, it's from the Latin limen, meaning threshold, which you might think is the same etymology as limbo, a space at the edge of hell in Catholic theology, right? Sort of between heaven and hell. Possibly a temporary space, depending on which theologian you ask, making it even more liminal, a kind of metaphysical waiting room. But limbo actually comes from a different Latin word, limbus, which means edge or boundary. But if you're confused about the meaning of liminal, remembering the connection to limbo is not entirely misleading. So the adjective liminal is pretty common academic jargon in a lot of different fields. As far as I can tell, it was popularized by a 1964 paper by anthropologist Victor Turner called Betwixt and Between: The Liminal Period and Rite de Passage. That is, rites of passage, rituals of coming of age, of marriage, of birth, of death. Turner writes, all rites of transition are marked by three phases: separation, margin, or limen, and aggregation. So this paper describes how in many tribal cultures there are rituals that mark the moments of transformation of major life stages. And obviously we have analogous rituals in industrialized cultures too. A bar mitzvah, for example, marks the transition of a boy into manhood. So in a coming of age ritual where a boy is transformed into a man, he separates from boyhood, experiences a kind of ritual death during this liminal middle stage, and then is reborn as a man. In contemporary cultures, this tends not to be a ritual, but more a protracted period that we call adolescence, from age 12 to age 18, where you are in a sort of liminal life stage where you transition from child to adult. If adolescence is a liminal stage in a human life, then what is a liminal space? Well, a place in between. Places that feel like limbo, twilight zones.
It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge.
The most literal liminal spaces include things like hallways or corridors, probably the prototype of a liminal space. Also roads, waiting rooms, bus terminals, jet bridges, places that are not destinations in and of themselves, but transitional spaces that are designed to get you from one place to another. Places you're not really meant to linger in. This would also include things that are closer to the etymological root, meaning thresholds, so doors, gates, portals. These are maybe the most literal examples, but we can get more abstract and say that a home with no furniture is liminal because it's emblematic of this liminal state of moving. The Liminal Spaces subreddit defines liminality in media as a sense of lingering in a region or state that would usually be passed without a second's thought. And by taking a photo of such places, you are drawing attention to them, causing reflection on these spaces, which often feels kind of eerie. Places where reality is altered. These places that are not really meant to be looked at with scrutiny are being given aesthetic consideration, and this results in a certain vibe. That vibe is the topic of this tangent. The popularization of liminal spaces as a trend is something that I have mixed feelings about, because on the one hand, I love liminal spaces, but on the other hand, I feel this sense of regret, because secretly in my heart, I feel like I invented this, and like I missed my chance to be the one who delivered the truth of liminal spaces unto us. Like I could have been the Tesla, the Nikola Tesla, not the company, fuck that, the Nikola Tesla of liminal spaces, but I was not, so so that's too bad for me. But I don't know, like ever since I was a kid, I feel that I've been haunted by the liminal. Like I used to play The Sims. I still do this. You guys have seen me play The Sims. And I would make these kind of surreal lots with black and white checkerboard tile. I would put street lamps and torii gates. That's those Japanese gates. I guess it's pronounced tori, but I don't want to say the Japanese art because I'm afraid it will make me sound like a pretentious asshole. It's a gate that they put at the entrance to Shinto shrines, and it delineates the world of the sacred from the world of the profane. A very liminal threshold. I got this feeling of like eerie exhilaration from such things as the lamppost at the entrance to Narnia, that room at the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey, the bar in the Overlook Hotel, hotel hallways, indoor pools. In 2012, I had a month where I didn't have a job and I had a little bit of money saved, but I had a landlady who required that I had a job. So every day I would get up at 8 a.m., I would leave the house. I lived in Washington, D.C. at the time, so I would just go to the Library of Congress and I would spend 8 hours at the Library of Congress reading and pretending to have a job. But I discovered that underneath the Library of Congress, there is this system of tunnels that filled me with an indescribable feeling that I now recognize as the liminal. I used to write stories where I tried to capture this feeling that I was having in hallways and tunnels at the Narnia lamppost. But of course, that's the frustration of being an artist, right? What causes an artist to succeed is that they are the one who gives convincing expression to a thing that many other people have experienced. Like Sartre with his nausea, Proust with his like sudden like memory explosion when he tastes the magical cookie. It's a really bad summary of Proust. But what matters in art is being the person who actually did it. And I didn't actually do it. So I totally didn't invent it. It's just a missed opportunity. I'm just gonna have to accept that I'm not special. I was just feeling something that thousands of people were also feeling. And I, like them, did not put it into words until the internet did it for me. Let's look at some more examples of liminal space images. Let's get a sense of the variety. An empty grocery store at night. An illuminated doorway in the midst of a dark void. Inscrutable Ukrainian fountains. Rock bottom from SpongeBob SquarePants. Schools at night. Leaving the movie theater. Empty beaches early in the morning. Traffic lights when there are no cars around late at night. A secret 90s Burger King behind a demolished wall. Mysterious light in an abandoned hospital. On my way back to the room from the pool, my swimsuit's still dripping water. Bikini bottom, out of business. Underground bunker meant to emulate normal suburban life in America. I took a nap. Now everybody's gone. Even on a beautiful day, something felt off about my apartment complex. Never gonna give you up. Empty roads. More empty roads. Playgrounds at night. Shopping carts, but it's liminal. Arizona, but it's liminal. The laundromat, but it's liminal. Mushrooms. Highway overpasses. Brutalist hellscapes. Alone. 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 Except for the mushroom. And the snail. The snail. Are you wondering what these images have in common? Like, what makes this a genre? I am also wondering that. Freud, mein Vati, sprach that aesthetics is not merely the theory of beauty, but the theory of the qualities of feeling. So what are the qualities of feeling associated with liminal space imagery? Well, in 2020, I was actually planning a main channel video on liminal spaces, which I really should have made, because if I had done it then, it would have been the foundational video essay on liminal spaces. But now it's too late. Regret. But when I was pre-writing for this video, I brainstormed a list of words that I associated with liminal space images. Here it is. Dark nostalgia, dreamlike, mysterious, transitory, twilight, purgatory, lonely, atmospheric, background, eerie, creepy, passive, uncanny familiarity, nostalgia for a thing I don't remember, feels like I've been here in a dream, strangely familiar, ambiguity, disorientation. I also made a list of antithetical qualities, qualities that would disqualify an image from being a liminal space. Homely, cozy, familiar, happy nostalgia, active, foreground subject, crowded, terrifying or intensely fearful, rather than eerie and atmospheric. It can be useful to define things by the negative, so what is the opposite of liminal space imagery? I immediately think of something like cottagecore, the cottagecore aesthetic, which is all about idyllic, pastoral coziness. Warm, comfy, homey, or something like Norman Rockwell, a family around the dinner table. This feels the opposite of a liminal space image. We could also contrast liminal spaces with surrealism. A painting by Dali is a little bit too unrealistic to be a liminal space. Many liminal space images are literally just photographs of like a laundromat. It's subtle. There's no psychedelic hallucinations, there's no clocks melting, there's no eldritch beings invading reality, nor are there any monsters, right? It's not scary enough to be horror. A contrasting example people bring up a lot is the phenomenon of the backrooms, which started from a 4chan post and is now a popular internet aesthetic in its own right. In 2019, someone posted to 4chan a photo of a yellowish corridor with the title The Backrooms, and the text, if you're not careful and you no-clip out of reality in the wrong areas, you'll end up in the backrooms, where it's nothing but the stink of old moist carpet, the madness of mono yellow, the endless background noise of fluorescent lights at maximum hum buzz, and approximately 600 million square miles of randomly segmented empty rooms to be trapped in. God save you if you hear something wandering around nearby, because it sure as hell has heard you. And the phone rang one last time, and when he answered, It was a child playing a haunted game cartridge, and that child was dead. A lot of people in the Liminal Spaces fandom feel that the Backrooms is responsible for the endemonining of the entire phenomenon, in part because the Backrooms is popular with teenagers. It spawned a bunch of YouTube videos and video games where like, ooh, a monster is chasing you around the Backrooms. And this is not liminal, right? Because the whole liminal aesthetic is based on this kind of eerie stillness. And the minute you start throwing monsters in, that's just horror, right? It's a different thing. But that difference is interesting. It clarifies what it is that feels special about liminal space images. It's not just that they're scary. They may not even be scary. At this point, a lot of YouTube video essayists have done videos on liminal spaces, so I am late to the game. And many of these essayists try to define and lay out what a liminal space is. What is probably the foundational video essay on YouTube about liminal spaces is a video called Liminal Spaces Exploring an Altered Reality by Solar Sands. Solar Sands' definition of a liminal space is a transitional space that is unsettling. He gives examples like an abandoned mall, a playground at night, and he also calls attention to features like decontextualized design. It has to be an artificial space with no people in it, a playground with no children, a shopping mall with no shoppers. And this does seem to be constitutive of the genre, so you can find sort of near-miss images that are almost liminal spaces, but not quite. For example, this image feels eerie and lonely, but there's people in it, and they're in nature, so it's not a liminal space. Or there's this image of Monument Valley in Arizona, which is surreal, but it's not liminal, because it's natural. We can't really say that it's transitional because there's no human design element. Another photo of Monument Valley has the same surreal elements, the surreal landscape, but it is liminal because it has a stop sign in a road, which gives you that feeling of lingering in a place that's meant to be quickly traversed. Another YouTube liminal space theorist is a essayist called Super Eyepatch Wolf, who made a video called Horror in Impossible Places, Liminal Spaces and the Backrooms. And Mr. Wolf defines liminal spaces by 3 pillars. 1, transitory emptiness. 2, uncanny nostalgia. And 3, surreal, artificial, or dreamlike quality. He rightly notices that a lot of these images rely on a kind of deja vu feeling, an uncanny nostalgia, abandoned arcades, a defunct Toys R Us, empty movie theaters with 90s carpeting. And Mr. Wolf also describes what he calls liminal horror, which is based on the anxiety of being trapped in a transitional space. The fear is, what if this moment in between never ends? And he speculates that the reason that liminal space imagery got so popular in the last 3 years has to do with the coronavirus pandemic, which I think is almost certainly correct. You saw a lot of images being shared, like that famous Hopper painting Nighthawks, edited so that the bar is empty. I think especially towards the beginning of the pandemic, 2020, 2021, a lot of us were in a transitional state. We didn't know what the world was going to become. And there was this fear that the old world is gone and we're going to be trapped in this lonely, spectral, liminal space forever. And I think that that feeling was really captured by liminal spaces. I think it's why I finally was considering making a video about it. I think it's why this went from a niche interest to like an internet phenomenon during that time. So I totally agree. I also like how Mr. Wolf, that's his name now, he mentions that many people find something actually comforting about liminal spaces. And he theorizes that this is because in liminal spaces, you have no identity because there's not a social context for identity to be expressed. So your house says something about you. The kind of bars you go to say something about you, and you're interacting with other people in them where your identity is relevant. But if you are alone on a road in Monument Valley, or if you're stranded in an empty airport hallway, your identity becomes kind of irrelevant. Class, race, gender, how much money you make, how you're dressed, whether you're old or young or beautiful or ugly, these things don't matter because you're in this in-between place where you're sort of ritually dead almost. And I think that that can be freeing. I find it exhilarating as well as comforting, actually. The comfort is captured by another popular Tumblr post. I really enjoy just existing in hotels. The long identical hallways, the soulless abstract art, the weird noises the air conditioner makes, strange city lights in the window 6 stories off the ground, strangers chatting in the hall, nothing in the dresser, no past, but an infinite present. I totally agree with that, by the way. I love hotels. I found them to be the most comforting liminal spaces, in part because they feel like a respite from my life. It's a break from context, and so there's this sort of exhilarating sense of possibility. I could do anything and be anything. Apart from the obvious pragmatic reasons, I think that this is one of the reasons why people choose hotels as settings to carry on affairs. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's a world apart from the world. Am I saying that Las Vegas is liminal? Yes, it's super fucking liminal. So there's a comfort in liminal spaces, but we now have kind of a paradox on our hands because we've been describing liminal spaces as eerie, as uncanny, as unsettling. How can something be comfortable and unsettling? These emotions are fundamentally at odds with each other. So what is going on? How is this possible? I think part of the issue is that in a lot of liminal space images, there's kind of a lot of aesthetic elements in play at once that contribute to a complex mix of feelings. And it's very difficult to kind of tease apart the different strands. So in addition to being liminal, a lot of liminal space imagery is also uncanny or weird or surreal or eerie. Now, some people have suggested that the liminal is reducible to those emotions, right? That we're simply talking about images that are uncanny or weird or surreal or eerie and calling them liminal because the internet has lost their mind. If this tangent has a thesis, and maybe it doesn't, maybe I'm just throwing out ideas, whatever, it's a tangent, I'm allowed to do that. But if this tangent has a thesis, I think it's that the liminal is an aesthetic category in its own right, and it's not merely reducible to other categories like the uncanny, the weird, the surreal, or the eerie. Often it exists alongside those categories or those feelings, but I think that the liminal deserves to be not just a concept of a transitional moment or transitional space, but part of aesthetic experience. And in order to argue for that, I think we need some more examples. So let's leave behind the internet photography genre and let's talk about some examples from film or from video games. Part 2, liminal art. Maybe I'm stating the obvious here, but the prototype for a lot of liminal cinema is Alice in Wonderland, 1951. This story and the Disney adaptation are foundational for other aesthetic movements, especially the psychedelic. Certainly there's elements of the surreal. Going down the rabbit hole is a dead metaphor for conspiracy theorists everywhere, but I still feel that if we're going to talk about liminal spaces, the rabbit hole deserves a mention. A lot of liminal art involves this device of two worlds, and in Alice in Wonderland there's the human world and there's Wonderland, and the liminal space between those worlds is the rabbit hole. And in the Disney movie there is a sequence that is the prototype for a lot of other cinematic sequences. We could even call it a rabbit hole sequence, which is a series of liminal spaces connecting one world to another. So we have the darkened portal, the threshold, the rabbit hole viewed from the outside. Alice follows the white rabbit into it, and then she falls, and there's this descent with psychedelic colors and the surreal element of ordinary objects, household furniture appearing as she tumbles down. And when she gets to the bottom, it's like upside down MC Escher tunnel where she continues to follow the white rabbit. There is a checkerboard floor. The checkerboard floor is a liminal motif that shows up again and again and again. And for more than a decade, I've been trying to formulate a theory of why the checkerboard floor is liminal. I've got nothing. It's associated with Freemasons, apparently, because a lot of Masonic temples use this black and white checkerboard floor motif, but I don't know how to connect that to anything else without sound like I'm going like full schizoid. Is it ableist for me to say schizoid? Probably. Let's put it this way. It's hard for me to talk about Freemasons without feeling like I sound like the kind of person who talks about Freemasons. So Alice goes into the portal, down the rabbit hole, through the tunnel, and then there's a series of doors, more thresholds. It could not be more liminal. And there's something exhilarating about this sequence, the feeling of the ordinary world being transcended as we venture down into the surreal world. And this type of sequence shows up again and again and again in other movies. I feel like it's kind of constitutive of the liminal in cinema. Another really obvious example is the Studio Ghibli movie Spirited Away, which you could call a kind of Japanese Alice in Wonderland. Like the beginning of Alice, the first 20 or 30 minutes of Spirited Away involve a young girl passing through a series of liminal spaces as she goes from the human world to the spirit world. So much of this movie is set in liminal spaces. The instigating event is that Chihiro's family is moving, and moving is very liminal. The family is between worlds, between lives. Chihiro is mourning the loss of her old life, and she's going to have to die symbolically and be reborn in order to enter her new life and her new house. And the plot gets going when Chihiro's family's car comes to a stop in front of this darkened tunnel, this portal, a classic liminal space image. And this begins the rabbit hole sequence through the dark tunnel into this abandoned, almost theme park kind of area. And then when Chihiro enters the spirit world, she goes over this bridge, a liminal space, up an elevator, another liminal space. Later on, there's a train station and a train. So much of this movie is liminal spaces. And I think that's how it achieves a lot of its aesthetic effect, is through this series of transitional spaces that make you feel, one, a human traversing the space that divides the human world from the spirit world, and two, this kind of coming of age story where Chihiro goes from a whiny brat to becoming a new person. She's brave and she can take initiative and she learns hard work. And all of this is possible. Why? Because it's liminal. It's just so fucking liminal. Let's talk about The Matrix. Obviously, The Matrix also alludes to Alice in Wonderland, Follow the White Rabbit.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole.
Again, we have this theme of two worlds, the Matrix and the Desert of the Real. Two worlds is a motif that shows up again and again in almost anything that is kind of surreal or liminal. David Lynch's movies often have a two worlds theme, whether it's in Blue Velvet, where you have the goody two-shoes, wholesome American small town world, and the seedy underworld, or Mulholland Drive, where there's this constant ambiguity between the human world and this dream world. The Matrix has a really good rabbit hole sequence. It begins after Neo gets the shrimp robot sucked out of his navel. They walk up this spiral staircase with checkerboard tile. There's that motif again. And into the room where Morpheus offers Neo the blue pill and the red pill, which, as I'm saying this and looking at myself in the monitor, I'm realizing that that room obviously unconsciously inspired my decorating of this room. So great. Tufted leather wingback chairs around a fireplace. Sure. I guess I have no original ideas. Amazing. Anyway, it's a dark and stormy night. Neo takes the red pill. He emerges from his pod in the real world. And then there's this hyperspace version of the Morpheus room where Morpheus explains to Neo the reality of recent human history. A rabbit hole sequence. A series of liminal spaces. It's super fucking liminal. The Chronicles of Narnia. When Lucy wanders through the wardrobe, she finds this lamppost. The lamppost is liminal. It's hard to explain why. I mean, I suppose it has to do with the positioning of the lamppost as the first thing that she sees in Narnia, but also there's the kind of other like eerie elements of a lamppost in the snow is kind of surreal, and the fact that C.S. Lewis chose to use that as the emblem of the entrance into a new world, what can I say but liminal? So Wonderland, the bathhouse, the Desert of the Real, the entrance to Narnia, these are some really obvious examples of rabbit hole sequences that invoke what I think is the feeling of the liminal. And we can maybe consider some darker versions, because all the ones I've mentioned I actually find exhilarating. Exhilaration is a emotional element of experiencing the liminal that I feel like is not often mentioned, but it's something that I think is a big part of it, and I'll talk more about that later. But there can also be a very dark version of this. I feel like I have to mention the 2020 Charlie Kaufman movie, I'm Thinking of Ending Things, a really dismal piece of liminal art with all these really dark liminal spaces. The Tulsi Town ice cream stand, surrounded by this awful black snowy void, those haunting high school hallways. What is the meaning of these liminal spaces? Maybe it's that the janitor character is occupying a kind of liminal space between fantasy and reality. It's sort of more skeptical and more grim than the other magical realism works that I've talked about up till now. These hallways are kind of evocative of, one, maybe the janitor's passage from struggling with suicidal thoughts to sort of his acceptance of his suicide, if that's the interpretation of that movie that we have. But he's also between worlds in the sense that he is physically in these liminal high school hallways, while mentally he's in this fantasy world. That's what we call liminal. Another darker liminal movie might be 2019's Us. Those rabbit tunnels, literally down the rabbit hole where the tethered lived, are very liminal. And at the beginning of the movie, there's this incredibly eerie sequence where baby Adelaide gets separated from her parents at the boardwalk, and she wanders down to the beach and into this darkened doorway of the funhouse. Shaman's vision quest, find yourself. Oh, it's so creepy. The funhouse is a liminal space, again, between worlds, right? This is the point of contact between the overworld and the underworld, where Adelaide meets her doppelganger and the fateful switch occurs. And let's compare the images of the threshold, the darkened doorway to the rabbit hole in Alice, the darkened tunnel in Spirited Away, the darkened entrance to the funhouse in Us. They're similar images of a liminal space. That darkness invites us into the space between worlds. The liminal is an aesthetic of in-betweenness. It induces a feeling of being between worlds, between stages of life. The liminal is a space of transformation, where possibilities open up, where you can die and be reborn as someone new. Mr. Anderson has to die so that Neo can be born. Baby Adelaide has to enter the underworld so that she can become the revolutionary Red. And Chihiro learns life lessons about hard work or something, I don't know. Respecting the river spirit. This is the major theme of that foundational academic text, Victor Turner's Betwixt and Between. Of the liminal stage and rites of passage, Turner says, the symbolism attached to and surrounding the liminal persona is complex and bizarre. Much of it is modeled on human biological processes, which are conceived to be what Levi-Strauss might call isomorphic with structural and cultural processes. Human biology is generally the metaphor through which we understand reality. So rites of passage often invoke images of death, of birth, of pregnancy. The person you were symbolically dies, and you're born again into a new role. The need for rituals, I think, has to do with a human discomfort with liminality in general, with ambiguity and with continuums. The liminal threatens essentialist categories, and rituals compensate for that threat by making the continuum into a binary, by making it discrete. Adolescence is liminal, it's uncomfortable. There's a transition from girlhood to womanhood, which essentialist thinking can't tolerate. So the ritual restores clarity. It says, yesterday you were a girl, but today you are a woman. Turner quotes this idea in Mary Douglas's 1966 book, Purity and Danger. Quote, what is unclear and contradictory from the perspective of social definition tends to be regarded as ritually unclean. The unclear is the unclean. From this standpoint, one would expect to find that transitional beings are particularly polluting. And maybe this is why I'm so interested in this topic. I am a transitional being. Transgender people are liminal. We transition or remain between categories that are supposed to be fixed and immutable. And this is threatening to the symbolic order. It makes people anxious. But as a liminal being, I guess I feel seen and almost validated by liminal spaces. I feel at home in a place that's not a home. Quoting Turner, liminality may perhaps be regarded as the nay to all positive structural assertions, as a realm of pure possibility whence novel configurations of ideas and relations may arise. I really enjoy just existing in hotels. This to me is what's exciting about liminal spaces, about hotels, about lobbies, about waiting rooms and weird tunnels under the Library of Congress. It's a kind of liberation from the past and from the impositions of social order. At rock bottom, SpongeBob can't even tell which bathroom is which. How can trans people be persecuted in such an environment? In 2021, I streamed a puzzle game called Superliminal, which uses liminal spaces and perspective-bending gameplay to tell a story about personal transformation. I thought this game was really beautiful. It's helpful in the way that a psychedelic trip is helpful, by detaching you from the homely, cozy, familiar feelings of nostalgic aesthetics. I feel like liminal aesthetics maybe even contain some kind of radical potential. Smoke another blunt, maybe the liminal is even an answer to the reactionary aesthetics of nostalgia. Part 3. Nostalgia. I'm suspicious of nostalgia. Nostalgia is counter-revolutionary, and it must be destroyed. Nostalgia obviously is a staple of reactionary aesthetics. It looks backward and idealizes the past. Return. We used to be a country. A proper country. Roman statues as profile pictures. 1950s idealization. Even something as innocent as cottagecore is suspect. There's kind of an uneasy thing going on with cottagecore where it's like 50% lesbians and 50% trad wives. For lesbians, cottagecore is escapist fantasy. This imagining of a pastoral utopia where you can escape from all the problems that we have in city life and live with your lover in a cottage and in a garden with no bugs and no homophobes. But for the trad wives, cottagecore is like this reactionary, like homestead nonsense where it's like, oh, stay in the home and bake loaves of bread every day for my hubby. Like, like I don't know. It gets sinister real fast. So you got to keep an eye on nostalgia. Keep an eye on it. You know, all the Greek scholars who follow me on Patreon, which I assume is most of you, will recognize that nostalgia is a Greek word, but it's actually a neologism from the 17th century. It comes from nostos, meaning homecoming, Odysseus, hey, how are you? And algos, meaning pain or despair. Algolagnia. The word nostalgia was actually coined by Swiss mercenaries in the 17th century to describe their pathological condition of longing for their home in the Alps. For some reason, in the 17th and 18th centuries, there was a lot of Swiss mercenary soldiers who wanted to be back home with their mothers in the beautiful mountain landscapes of Switzerland instead of dying on the battlefield for a French king who doesn't know that they exist. I can't imagine why. Nostalgia was a diagnosable medical condition among soldiers in the 18th and 19th centuries. This was considered mental illness. The fact that you would rather be home in a beautiful pastoral landscape than engaging in 18th century warfare, which is completely irrational, of course. What's not appealing about putting on your uniform every day, lining up in neat little lines, and simply murdering each other? That's enough out of you, Hans. Stop pining for the Alps. Shut up and die like a man. Rashid Lotf is a contemporary artist who paints these hyper-nostalgic scenes of affluent 90s boyhood. Okay, not paintings, they're silkscreen printings. I don't know how art works. Silkscreen printings of lavish, nostalgic scenes of retro gaming excess. His work actually kind of reminds me of the Italian painter Giovanni Paolo Panini, who painted these ancient Roman halls full of oil paintings, paintings of paintings, extremely opulent, extremely lavish work. Obviously the market for this artwork is 80s and 90s kids who want to just indulge in this gallon ice cream jug of nostalgic excess, which is fine. I think it's fine. Please do not harass the artist, you maniacs. But these images have been misappropriated by reactionary Twitter, in particular by a Twitter user called Wocal Distance. Wocal Distance, whose Twitter bio includes a description from Media Matters that refers to him as Michael Young, prominent on right-wing Twitter under the handle Wocal Distance, primarily for invoking 1990s nostalgia toward reactionary ends. And that about sums it up. Prep your bus for some deranged nonsense, because you're not ready for this. This is a world worth fighting for, and the ache of the nostalgia we feel for this time is the call home. The call to Tamagotchis, Pokemon cards, toy soldiers, Game Boys, spaghetti and meatballs, PlayStation 1. There appear to be no integrating forces, no unified meaning, no true inner understanding of phenomena in our experience of the world. Experts can explain anything in the objective world to us, yet we understand our own lives less and less. Blockbuster. In short, we live in the postmodern world where everything is possible and almost nothing is certain. Pepsi. This is not consumerism. Sans the Nintendo, but that's a minor quibble. The Nintendo is the point. That is not consumerism. Okay, so that's deranged, right? This is a deranged person posting deranged things online. The cognitive dissonance is astounding, right? It's just denial at work. This person obviously feels a nostalgia for N64 in the 90s or whatever. And like, I understand that when you are 12 years old, video games are very exciting. I get that. But the excitement that you felt for Tamagotchi and Pokemon, that is you being successfully marketed to as a child by Japanese corporations. Your insistence on denying this is because you cannot reconcile the pangs of genuine nostalgia that you feel with cynical adult understanding of how marketing works. So instead, you've elected to completely detach from reality and deny the extremely obvious fact that children's Christmas morning hysteria about a new N64, you're just saying that it's not consumerism, when what else is it? The transcendental truth? This reminds me of what Camus says in his Myth of Sisyphus essay, where he refers to the nostalgia of unity as this longing for coherent, rational, logical narrativization of the world. Reactionaries in general cannot accept like the brutal realities of capitalism. They have to mythologize it and imagine that like there was this genuine magic about like Tamagotchi. Nostalgia is self-deception. Like you think that the world was pure and simple because you were pure and simple because you were 11 years old. That's what, in the 90s you were 11 and that's why you think that it's magic. The world was not simple. The world was not pure. You were a baby and you didn't know who Milosevic is and you didn't know about the genocide in Rwanda because you weren't paying attention. And you didn't have any critiques of the Clinton administration because you were a kid and you were spending 12 hours a day playing Mario Kart. This is not philosophy. This is not social criticism. You are melting your brain. I feel like I'm losing my mind sometimes. I was recently watching this YouTube video that's like 1 hour of 90s Christmas commercials. And it is pretty wild for me to watch because I was a child in the 90s and I actually remember some of these commercials.
He's good, but I think he's missing something. Friend.
McDonald's wishes you a holiday season spent with the people who make you smile.
I don't know if I want to say it was a simpler time, but I will say that the advertisements back then made more straightforward appeals to sort of nostalgic Christmas feelings. But of course, the aim of all that is just cynical salesmanship, right? But if you read the YouTube comments on this video, girl, delusions are rampant. Christmas isn't even like this anymore, sadly. I remember Christmas as being magical and a time of family love and friends, not who bought who the best gift and who bought the most gifts. These hurt my heart because I miss those days so much. Everything is so commercial now, and there's no meaning behind Christmas anymore. Families don't even get together like they used to. It's very sad. Stacy, you are posting about how Christmas used to be less commercial on a video of Christmas commercials from the 90s. These people's brains have been deep fried by the Matrix. Like, we're so far detached from any kind of genuine spiritual feeling that I wonder what people think when they watch like the Charlie Brown Christmas special where Linus gives this speech about how the true meaning of Christmas is Jesus is born in a manger in Bethlehem, and Charlie Brown is disgusted by Snoopy winning this Christmas light competition. These people think the true meaning of Christmas is a commercial for Honey Bunches of Oats. Families don't come together anymore. We used to sit around the TV watching McDonald's commercials. Whatever happened to that? Captain Crunch just doesn't have the Christmas spirit anymore. Sad. Coca-Cola used to mean something. I don't know if I've ever seen a sadder spectacle of the decay of the human mind than this clinging to commercials of Yuletides past. Your childhood doesn't exist anymore, and no amount of Fruity Pebbles can bring it back. Shut up and die like a man. These people have ascended to the 9th dimension, I swear to God. It reminds me of this Fran Lebowitz bit about how people of her generation think that New York in the 70s was like this utopian, ideal, romantic place. And Fran's just like, no, New York in the 70s wasn't a utopia. You were just 20, and being 20 in New York City is exciting. And now you're 55, and so you think that things were good because you're remembering being 20. That's not the world getting worse. You're getting worse. I guess not a lot of people can accept mortality with grace. I don't know if I can do it. I'm trying my best. Is it possible to die an elegant death when your brain is this full of advertisements for Honey Bunches of Oats? Nostalgia is just hope pointed backwards. That said, nostalgia, I'm bringing this back around, bring it back on topic, back on the rails. Nostalgia is unquestionably an element in a lot of liminal space imagery. It's one of the most popular types of liminal space image. The abandoned Toys R Us, dead malls, dead arcades. It's usually focused on the 80s and 90s, I suspect because most people posting on Reddit and Tumblr are people born between 1980-ish and Y2K-ish. I actually posted a thread on Twitter asking people about their liminal nostalgic experiences, whether people who are older than millennials or younger than millennials have different experiences, whether people in other countries have different experiences. One thing a lot of people bring up is a kind of Soviet version of nostalgic liminal images. There's a whole Polish subgenre of Polish core nostalgia that still feels liminal to me. It still has that eerie feeling, but without triggering the kind of, oh, my childhood is dead type trip. Liminal nostalgia is not happy nostalgia. It's not cozy, it's not comfortable. I feel like in this way it sort of resists reactionary appropriation because liminal nostalgia is not necessarily telling us that the past was better. It's just telling us that the past is dead. I think you could reasonably ask whether some of these nostalgic liminal spaces are in fact liminal spaces at all. Why is an empty arcade a liminal space? You have to start getting abstract in your view of liminality. The argument would have to go that these desolate, nostalgic places are liminal in the sense that they confront you with the space between what was and what is. Your childhood versus the person you are now, and that's the source of this emotional effect. I guess it's similar to the playground at night. A space designed to be full of lively people is instead eerily empty. I don't know, there's a lot going on with these images that we could analyze. Let's talk about the uncanny. Let's talk about the weird and the eerie. Let's talk about the surreal. Let's talk about hauntology. All right, that's a lot of things. One at a time, please. Part 4, hauntology. I find hauntology to be a frustrating piece of jargon coined by our good friend Derrida in a 1990 book, The Spectre of Marx. I don't know, man. I'm just trying to make a Patreon video about low-definition images of hallways. Is there really a need to drag our good friend Derrida into this? There's a frustrating tendency in post-structuralist philosophy and cultural theory to rely on wordplay in place of, arguments and stuff. I feel like hauntology is a case of that. Ontology is the study of existence, of being. So hauntology is a pun on that, right? And it works better in French where the H is silent. Ontology? I don't know how to say French. Et maintenant, the idea is fairly obvious. The human present is always haunted by pasts and futures. This goes back to phenomenological philosophy of people like Husserl, who pointed out maybe something obvious, but an obvious thing that has interesting implications. If you perceive a melody, you only hear, we only experience one moment at a time. That's how time works. And yet, our experience is incomprehensible without reference to the past and the future. So a melody is only comprehensible in terms of our ability to sort of synthesize the notes that come before the current note and to anticipate the notes that will come next. This we could take as a kind of simple example of the way that humans perceive time in general. The human present is always haunted by the past and the future. This concept was expanded by our favorite communist theorist, Mark Fisher, who's sort of the socialist thinker of my generation. Fisher wrote an essay called What is Hauntology?, where he applies this concept to music criticism in particular, and he describes the way specifically that the present is haunted by lost futures. Well, what does that mean? According to Fisher, hauntology involves a confrontation with a cultural impasse, the failure of the future. For example, you may have noticed that electronic music doesn't really seem futuristic, quote unquote, anymore. Fisher believes that past decades, the 70s and 80s in particular, involved cultural production, artistic production that anticipated a future that would be different from the present, that would be different from the past, and electronic music was one of the emblems of that. The 21st century has involved a kind of disillusionment with the idea of the future. We've kind of given up on the idea that the future can be better than the past or better than the present. And this is related to what Fisher calls capitalist realism, the abandonment of our capacity to imagine a better future. We assume that our current form of capitalism is the end of history. We cannot improve on it. We've ceased to hope for a better system. There's not a socialist utopia coming. There's not a techno future coming. I might dispute that because I do think that a lot of CEOs, for example, Zuckerberg, Musk, they are futurists still. They believe that, I don't know if you know the concept of long-termism, but this is a very influential idea among the most powerful capitalists in the world, is this idea that they really do believe in a utopian future. But the rest of us are cynical. We've abandoned the idea, and I think Fisher is particularly concerned with the fact that artists have abandoned the idea. So instead of sincerely imagining the future, we sort of practice a kind of retrofuturism. We pine for past ideas of what the future could be. And we see this in a lot of retro aesthetics, this kind of cultural fixation on the 80s, a time when the future seemed more full of promise. So according to Fisher, who began his career as a cultural theorist, as a music critic, he says, in music, as elsewhere in culture, we were living, in Franco Barati's suggestive phrase, after the future. What haunts the digital cul-de-sacs of the 21st century is not so much the past as all the lost futures that the 20th century taught us to anticipate. So for example, when we look at dead malls, we are experiencing the dead dreams of the 20th century. That's something I explored in my video on opulence, right? This idea of dead malls representing not just the end of an era of consumerism, but also the death of a certain kind of 20th century hope. The hope that everyone could achieve a level of luxury and opulence. It's something that we've kind of stopped believing. There's this sense that, quote, the future is no longer what it was. So this is the hauntological sense, according to Mark Fisher, and maybe the genre that represents the idea best is vaporwave. What is the sonic equivalent of a dead mall? Well, maybe something like this. Vaporwave was a movement in electronic music in the early 2010s that was very online. It was characterized by slowed down and looped samples of 80s pop music, of 80s muzak, mall music, Kmart music. Michael Jackson or disco, artists like Vectroid or Saint Pepsi. An aesthetic of warped 80s and 90s and early 2000s nostalgia. It was actually very influential on early leftist video essays. I mean, a lot of my early videos were very influenced by Vaporwave. My contribution to the aesthetic, I suppose, really was redoing the cover of Karl Marx's books as the sort of aesthetic, like 90s Miami look. And the appeal of this, I suppose, is that it represents a hauntological depiction of turn of the millennium consumerism, which is now eerie and uncanny to us. There's a kind of naivety to 90s consumerism or to 90s or 80s or 70s futurism. We can't believe in that promise anymore. And Vaporwave as a genre is an aesthetic of melancholy about the death of hope and the loss of that kind of way of imagining the future. These deranged comments on that YouTube video of 90s Christmas commercials, I wonder if this is what they're experiencing in a way. They're not able to articulate themselves very well. They are saying silly things like, things used to be less commercial back in the time of these commercials. But maybe what they're experiencing is that we used to believe more sincerely in the commercial, and now commercials have sort of adapted to our cynicism about capitalism. We don't really believe in the possibility of a better future. Vaporwave is decadent, it's melancholic, it's uncannily nostalgic without warmth. It's always been associated with leftist politics. A refrain in the comments of Vaporwave music videos on YouTube is, "This makes me nostalgic for a time I never knew." These people are really just quoting the fictional dictionary of obscure sorrows. The fictional jargon is anemoia, nostalgia for a place one has never known. I think what these people are really trying to articulate is what Mark Fisher calls hauntology. It's nostalgia for a future that never was. Maybe hope is just nostalgia pointed forwards. But there's always an ambiguity, even in this kind of melancholic nostalgia that's open to misappropriation by reactionaries. I remember in 2017 there was the emergence of a music genre called fashwave. Fascists attempting to take vaporwave aesthetics and use them for far-right purposes. Think Macintosh 420, but busts of Romans and Keck, Donald Trump, Chaudelet nonsense.
We will make America great again. I love you.
Ugh, 2017, what a hellish year. I guess the issue is lots of people of whatever politics feel that something with the present is off. We all long for something else, though there's no agreement about what that something is, whether it's in the past, whether it's in the future. It reminds me of the plaque that's displayed over the entrance to Disneyland. Here you leave today and enter the world of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy. People are really longing for anything except the present. Get us out of here. Part 5, The Uncanny. Maybe I've gotten ahead of myself with this hauntological stuff about the present is haunted by dead futures. Maybe the more obvious way to analyze the kind of liminal, nostalgic unease is through the more well-known framework of Freud and the uncanny. Without getting into dead futures, there's an obvious sense in which the past haunts us. We're not children anymore. We never will be. The dead toys are an emblem of dead childhood. It's not cozy nostalgia, it's uncomfortable, uncanny nostalgia. The Toys R Us is empty and it's super fucking liminal. Most people are aware of Freud's theory of the uncanny via the popular notion of the uncanny valley. The idea that there is a continuum of familiar human likeness to inanimate object, and somewhere in the middle of that there are objects like robots, like realistic dolls that are ambiguous. Are they inanimate or are they human? This uncertainty unsettles us, and it produces the effect of the uncanny. This understanding of the uncanny actually comes less from Freud, but from a theorist that Freud cites in his essay, someone called Jentsch, who I've never read, who no one seems to read. But Freud's theory of the uncanny is more, well, Freudian. Freud is very concerned with memory and repression and the way that a repressed memory can emerge as something unsettling. The strange within the familiar, the unfamiliar familiar. And of course, Freud being Freud, he frankly pins too much of his explanation on castration anxiety. Always with the castration anxiety. It's frustrating because there's a lot of good ideas that are thrown out in this essay. Freud's more general argument is that the uncanny, our feeling of the uncanny, involves the re-emergence of a repressed, once familiar thing. The uncanny for Freud is a kind of dark remembering. He quotes the philosopher Schelling, Hegel's roommate, for those following that drama, who wrote that the unheimlich, the uncanny, is the name for everything that ought to have remained hidden and secret and has become visible. Anyone who has a little bit of German knows that uncanny is actually a pretty bad translation of Freud's term unheimlich. Unheimlich more literally means unhomely, so the opposite of homely or familiar. Freud tells us that the un prefix is the token of repression, so the unhomely is something that was once homely, that was once familiar, but which has become unfamiliar. The unhomely is the home that is not a home. And so Freud is very concerned with repetitions, with déjà vu, and with doppelgangers. If you've ever been exploring a new city or a new space and you suddenly have this realization, I've been here before, that's the uncanny. The uncanny for Freud is always a repetition. So twins are uncanny. This is a common theme in horror movies. The Shining, Us, Black Swan, Annihilation. What makes a liminal space uncanny? What makes any place uncanny? We could ask, what is the landscape equivalent of doppelgangers? I'm reminded of this liminal space image of a housing development where it's a long row of identical houses fading into the distance. The repetition is uncanny. It's like the twins in The Shining, but the twins are houses, and there's like 50 of them. There's something unnerving about the idea that you can encounter the same space again and again and again, like you're trapped in a loop, like you're trapped in a loop, like you're trapped in a loop. Or consider this image, possibly my favorite liminal space image of a gas station reflected in the wet pavement, doubled, its own doppelganger, its own mirror image. It's really eerie. This to me is unhomely in Freud's sense. A lot of American architecture to me is uncanny. There's something uncanny about chain franchises. One Target is similar to every other Target no matter where you are. There's an uncanny feeling of repetition, doubling, multiplication, deja vu. And Fisher talks about this too, the way that capitalism replaces the distinctiveness of geography with a multiplying uncanny of non-places, of hyperplaces. Imagine you're driving on a highway and you pass the same house 6 times in a row. That's uncanny. It's alarming. But that's also how it feels to drive through America, because you cross the same shopping center with the same Exxon and the same Target and the same Chipotle again and again and again. It's uncanny. Is it liminal? It's super fucking liminal. A common caption or title for liminal space images online is strangely familiar places. People will usually comment that they feel like they've been here before, possibly in a dream. How's this effect achieved? Well, the familiar, the homely, is made unfamiliar or unhomely through often just photographic technique. Lighting. Take a place that's usually associated with daytime and photograph it at night. A playground at night. Places full of people are eerie when they're empty. Twilight. The liminal space between day and night is the most liminal time. Take a picture of anything at twilight, it gets a little more liminal. weird weather goes a long way. Snow can make a familiar place seem unfamiliar. A roller coaster, but in fog. That's what they call liminal. Concerning the unhomely home, Freud provides his very Freudian example of men who admit in psychoanalysis that they find the female genitals uncanny. And Freud's explanation for this is that all of us, having originated in the womb, once regarded that anatomy as home. And men are sort of experiencing this anxious recursion of the repressed homely when they encounter female genitals. I am not sure this makes sense, because why would it only be men who find female genitals uncanny when women, I don't know if you guys know this, but girls are also born out of, the vagina. Sigmund, this doesn't make sense, Gorge. I guess you could say that women never experience a repression or a defamiliarization with female genitals having that anatomy themselves. I feel like I'm stretching, though, to give him the benefit of the doubt. Freud really throws out a lot of ideas in this essay, though. It's not just a return to previous places or the encounter of things that have been repressed. He also talks about childhood complexes that we sort of outgrow. Part of the uncanny is when those complexes are reactivated. Quote, our conclusion could then be stated thus. An uncanny experience occurs either when repressed infantile complexes have been revived by some impression, or when the primitive beliefs we have surmounted seem once more to be confirmed. Okay, what's an example of an infantile complex? What is he talking about? Well, something like animism, the idea that inanimate objects have a sentience of their own, or superstition, the omnipotence of thoughts, the idea that thinking something can make it so. These are common patterns of thinking that you see in children. Freud thinks that he's observed them anthropologically in a quote-unquote primitive man, but he thinks that they sort of linger in repressed form in adults. And if something like deja vu or encountering the number 63 5 times in a single day, we experience these things as uncanny because they reactivate this kind of childish superstition and fear. The uncanny can result from a tension between what rational adults know can be true and the resurgence of what Carl Sagan called the demon-haunted world.
It lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge.
Is there a dark agency behind that phone ringing? Is the eerie TV static a portal to another world? These are the kinds of fears that animate us when we're children and we grow out of them, but a creepy work of art or a strange experience of deja vu can suddenly reactivate this old fear of childhood. For me, a lot of analog horror is uncanny in that it reminds me of this fear I had as a child of the TV, of static. Everyone seems to agree this is creepy, right? Like it's in a lot of 80s and 90s horror movies, like Poltergeist. The idea that after the last broadcast, they play the national anthem and then it's just like dead air all night. And that TV static is uncanny. One of the classic creepypastas is by Chris Straub, who's the founder of Analog Horror. He does YouTube videos now. Local 58, check it out if you're a horror fan. But he wrote this classic creepypasta more than a decade ago that's written in the form of this internet forum where commenters are reminiscing on this TV show they remember from their childhoods called Candle Cove. And their memories are sort of slowly recovered, and it gets creepier and creepier and creepier until it becomes like this nightmare that no adult would make. And then the twist ending, spoiler alert, I guess, is that one of them talks to their senescent mother, who reveals that when they watched Candle Cove, they were just watching the static on the TV. This is a really uncanny story to me in Freud's sense, because it's based on this re-emergence of childhood fear and childhood memory. These kinds of things that we're not supposed to believe in anymore. Suddenly you have an experience that makes you, again, kind of relitigate whether you think that these fears are valid. The fear of the dark is one of the most obvious childhood fears. H.P. Lovecraft wrote a letter to a friend of his, Marion F. Bonner, where he describes his childhood fear of the dark and the way that he was trained out of it by his grandfather, basically through exposure therapy, being forced to walk through dark rooms until it just didn't scare him anymore. But then he grew up to say, quote, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Darkness is the unknown." And I think a lot of what we find scary about darkness is that it kind of reactivates old childhood fear. You see this in a lot of liminal space images, even ones that are not overwhelmingly dark. There will often be like a dark door or a dark portal, again, sort of resembling the rabbit hole. Even if you don't notice that that dark door is there, I think unconsciously you perceive a subtle threat there. Snow and fog also obfuscate, they create a veil of poor visibility, which is fear of the dark. It's similar in a way to thalassophobia, the fear of ocean depths, which is also, I think, caused by poor visibility, fear of the unknown, scary childhood stuff, coming back. I don't know, I guess I'm just describing like the most obvious possible principle of horror, like low visibility equals creepy. It's why analog horror works so well. It's why there's so much VHS horror, low lighting, cheap digital cameras from 2005. There's maybe a double reactivation of childhood fears where you're using this kind of retro technology that is reminding you of your childhood when you were more afraid of things, and also the poor visibility is kind of inherently eerie. Okay, here's another childhood complex that is reactivated by a lot of liminal art. This fear of being separated from your parents in a strange place, alone, unable to get back to them. A really fundamental fear for a lot of children. SpongeBob plays on this in their very liminal episode Rock Bottom, where SpongeBob misses his bus stop and ends up in this really dark ocean town where everything is strange, where he can't get home. I'd argue that the back rooms actually reactivate this childhood fear of being separated from your parents. It's really scary when you're a kid to be lost in the grocery store, and I feel like the back rooms is, clipped into these weird back hallways. That's very much a childhood fear reanimated. That boardwalk sequence from the movie Us also really captures this terror of being separated from your parents, of being alone in a strange place. Spirited Away too. Chihiro's parents turn into pigs, and then she's forced to deal with this weird liminal space by herself. So maybe this is a loose interpretation of what Freud is saying, but I do think that the uncanny often relies on a kind of dark deja vu, this feeling of old terrors that you've kind of grown out of being reanimated. Irrational thinking takes hold of you again, and you're able to fear with childlike intensity. Part 6, the Eerie. So the uncanny is about the unfamiliar in the familiar, the strange in the familiar, the home that is no longer a home. I think we can say that the uncanny encapsulates a lot of the feeling of the sort of nostalgic liminal spaces, but that's not going to help us explain genuine unfamiliar elements and the kind of strangeness, not strangeness of the familiar, but just strangeness of the strange. Not all of these are forgotten childhood places come back to haunt me. Some of them are just weird. So let's go back to Mark Fisher and a different work of his final book, 2016's The Weird and the Eerie, a book on the aesthetic categories of, you guessed it, the weird and the eerie. Fisher defines the weird as that which does not belong, the collision of worlds that don't belong together, strange juxtapositions. In other words, basically surrealism. André Breton, the French surrealist manifesto writer, defined the aim of surrealism as to resolve the previously contradictory conditions of dream and reality into an absolute reality, a super reality that is the surreal. So this is what you see in Dali, for example, is a kind of visual, magical realism. Ordinary objects, ordinary scenes, combined with this kind of psychedelic dream logic. H.P. Lovecraft is the great writer of the weird. Lovecraft writes these stories where an overwhelmingly weird alien presence invades ordinary reality and breaks down every foundation of human perception and understanding. Liminal art tends not to rely too much on the weird. It's usually more subtle than Lovecraftian horror. Less weird and more eerie. So what is the eerie? Well, Mark Fisher has a little theory about it. Quote, "The sensation of the eerie occurs when there is something present where there should be nothing, or there is nothing present where there should be something." So there can be an eerie presence or an eerie absence. An example of an eerie presence would be the eerie cry of birds. The eerie presence often involves agency where there shouldn't be agency. An eerie feeling of being watched. You're alone, there's no one here, but you feel that there's a malignant agency observing you. That's an eerie presence. To use another Avine example, Hitchcock's The Birds. The birds are a malignant agency. Birds are not supposed to be agents, much less malignant ones. This creates a sense of eeriness. How about an example of an eerie absence? An eerie silence, we say, meaning there ought to be sounds, but there aren't. Eerie absences really tend to be the focus of liminal images. The dead mall. There should be people here, but there aren't. This prompts the question, what happened here and why? How did this ruin come to be? Where did the people go? What happened to them? The eerie is a feeling associated with ruins. I think it's responsible for the uncomfortable feeling of a lot of video games. Video games thrive on the eerie. A sense of eerie loneliness is very common in games. Often games are kind of empty. They take place in spaces like cities where you would expect huge crowds. But instead, especially if you're playing source maps, you're in a kind of eerily sort of post-apocalyptic space where you're wandering alone, a space where you would expect people to be. A city with no people besides you is eerie because of what Fisher calls the failure of presence. There ought to be people here, but there aren't. Being alone in your bedroom isn't eerie because you're supposed to be alone in your bedroom. What's more often eerie about bedrooms would be a failure of absence. So you're supposed to be alone in your bedroom, but you have a strange sense that you aren't. Someone's watching you. That's eerie. Just like a mall with no shoppers is eerie. A playground with no children is eerie. Ruins are eerie. What happened to the worshippers in this church? This is a very common source of poetic feeling. Ozymandias, King of Kings, look upon my works ye mighty and despair. Wordsworth at the ruins of Tintern Abbey. The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows defines the made-up word kenopsia as the eerie, forlorn atmosphere of a place that's usually bustling with people, but is now abandoned and quiet. A school hallway in the evening. An unlit office on a weekend. Vacant fairgrounds. An emotional afterimage that makes it seem not just empty, but hyper-empty. With a total population in the negative, who are so conspicuously absent they glow like neon signs. According to Fisher, there's an inherently speculative element to the eerie. What happened here? We're impelled to ask. Quote, confronted with Easter Island or Stonehenge, it is hard not to speculate about what the relics of our culture will look like when the semiotic systems in which they are currently embedded have fallen away. We are compelled to imagine our own world as a set of eerie traces. And of course, the Marxist Mark Fisher has to make it all about capitalism. What is he, a bread tuber? Cringe. Quote, capital is at every level an eerie entity. Conjured out of nothing, capital nevertheless exerts more influence than any allegedly substantial entity. I mean, I think he's right that capital as a kind of inhuman force that constructs our world adds to the eeriness of dead malls or to the uncanniness of chain franchises. Like, we can sense that these things are made and ruined by this inhuman force, similar to the kind of force that oh, I don't know, puts black rectangular monoliths in Louise's bedrooms. I'm really having a leftist moment here. Just peeing myself with fear over the concept of Taco Bell. Crying and vomiting because this Arby's looks just like the last one. I think that's my cue to put the joint down and wrap this up. Is this really unique to capitalism though? Isn't the state also an inhuman agent? Is Soviet architecture not eerie and menacing? There's a lot to unpack here. Part 7. What does it all mean? Why don't I re-summarize the aesthetic categories that we've gone over in this tangent so you at least have that to take away with you? The liminal. The liminal is the in-between. It's the transitional, a sense of lingering in a place, between worlds, or between stages of life. The uncanny is the strange within the familiar. Something that used to be homely appears as unhomely. The surreal is the juxtaposition of reality and dreams or fantasy. It's nearly synonymous with the weird, which is the presence of that which does not belong, the alien. The eerie is about the failure of presence or the failure of absence. Absinthe? The failure of absence. Either something is present when there should be nothing, that feeling of being watched when you're alone, eerie, or nothing is present where there should be something, as in ruins. Where did all the people go? Why are there no shoppers in this shopping mall? The eerie implies speculative questions about incomprehensible agencies at work. The unseen aliens of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Capitalism building and destroying these strip malls. Fucking capitalism, man. And of course, we have the hauntological. In Mark's sense, a place or a vaporwave remix that's haunted by the echoes of a lost future. I would argue that all of these elements are frequently present in liminal space images. The liminal is the defining feature, it's what makes the genre cohere, but the reality is that works of art and aesthetic experiences don't fit into neat little categories. Like it's the job of the aesthetic theorist to describe and clarify these categories, but good works of art usually fit many interpretations. And the best liminal space images are not just liminal spaces, like it's not just a photo of a road or a hallway, but they're images where the feeling of liminality is enhanced by eerie, weird, uncanny, nostalgic, hauntological, or surreal elements. The reason for all this jargon is we're trying to put words to feelings that resist description. Feelings that well up from our childhoods, our repressed memories, our abandoned hopes, our fears for the future, our confrontations with mortality. The places we grew up in are now desolate. Our world will outlive us. The reason that we should think about this stuff is so that we don't get hoodwinked into being nostalgic rubes by cynical reactionary nonsense that tries to persuade us that our most sensitive, vulnerable feelings are evidence of some kind of like neo-fascist reactionary nonsense. And I think to me this is all kind of personal in a weird way. Liminal spaces are a refuge to people for whom nostalgia has lost its sweetness. If going home is lonely to you,
coming home is terribly lonely.
The liminal is a refuge. It's comforting. I feel like a renter in this world. Home is always an improvised situation. And sometimes liminal art makes me feel that that's an exciting way to live. I'm not stuck in some delusion of the past. All my longings are in front of me. And I think that's beautiful.